Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counter the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, combustion engine cars to be no more. The European Union bans the sale of fossil fuel-powered autos by 2035 and wants to speed up the switch to electric. But is the bloc ready for the shift? Also this week, the profits of global airlines are taking off for the first time since the start of the pandemic. But can the industry keep up with the surge in travel demand? Plus, Sudan's forgotten crisis. 20 years on from the start of the conflict in Darfur, people say their lives have only got worse. Will the international community help? So the manufacture of cars powered by fossil fuels employs millions of people right across Europe. Automobiles account for 15% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the European Union. Well, the bloc wants to drastically reduce exhaust fumes as part of its ambitious plans to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Petrolheads are now being told to prepare for a cleaner ride. European lawmakers have put an expiration date on the sale of new cars with combustion engines. Carmakers will be required to cut 100% of carbon emissions in new vehicles sold in the European Union by 2035. The law includes exceptions for companies that produce fewer than 1,000 vehicles. Heavy trucks and buses are subject to a different set of rules that will slash carbon emissions over time. But some countries oppose the change. Among them is Italy, which has called the ban economic suicide for the bloc and a gift to the Chinese electric car industry. Critics of the law say the automotive industry is not ready for the shift and the move threatens tens of thousands of jobs in the European Union. Ford Motors has cut nearly 11% of its workforce in Europe over the next 3 years as part of its pivot to the production of EVs. Well, European leaders advocating action on climate change have pushed back against that argument.
The Industrial Revolution is happening, whether we like it or not. We can choose to lead it. We can choose to do it in a way that is socially compatible with our values, or we can leave it to other parts of the world to lead it, and then all we can do is follow and deindustrialize. We need to rebuild our industry on the basis of the future, and the car industry can lead this.
All right, let's take this on. We can speak now to Casper Rules, who's the Chief Data Officer at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, which is a price reporting agency and consultancy focused on the metals supply chain. Casper, first up, why is it that some European countries are pushing back against this ban?
I mean, I think there's some concern over whether the industry is going to be ready to move to a fully electrified future. Obviously, that's the target, but of course, there's lots of things that need to be in place to ensure that we can end the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles and move to electric. And that's not just having the cars there, there's charging infrastructure, and obviously all of the supply chain up from the car, including batteries, cathodes, anodes, and the raw materials at the mines.
Italy says it's economic suicide and it's handing the EV baton to China. Tell us about that.
Well, China, is heavily represented in the battery supply chain. As a rule of thumb, typically around 80% of the processing capacity of the raw materials all the way through to the finished batteries, that capacity sits in China. But we're starting to see that change. There's been a number of considerable investments throughout Europe and North America over the last several years, which is building out battery production capacity, and that's moving through to other parts of the value chain as well. So I think, China has had a head start, definitely, on electric vehicles. That's been a big focus of the government there for a long time, but the rest of the world is playing catch up today, and we're starting to see a lot of policy which is helping to make that shift.
And the shift is happening, isn't it? I mean, in December, Germany bought more EVs than cars with conventional engines. But you mentioned the charging infrastructure just now. Where are we with that across Europe?
Yeah, so charging infrastructure investments are continuing to happen. I think there's probably more anxiety about charging than in reality there is a problem. We're starting to see more and more charging sites crop up across the European region, but also people can charge at home. So those who have the option to park their vehicle at home, we're seeing a lot of charging happening there. But there's definitely still more to be done. But it's not just companies like Tesla who installed their charging network early on. We're starting to see traditional energy companies which have filling stations for internal combustion engine vehicles, starting to move some of that kind of that area over to electric charging as well. So whilst there is, of course, investments to be made, access to charging, generally speaking, is improving considerably throughout Europe.
Right, and there's also the issue of charging time and indeed journey time between charges, right?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of people who are commuters are not going to need to worry too much about charging on a daily basis. Charging times are coming down as we're starting to see technology improvements at the battery level and at the pack level, so the software and the hardware that manages the actual battery cells themselves. But yeah, it does still take longer than filling up a filling station. But of course, one of the benefits of electric vehicles is that you can do it at home. So you come home, park your car in your parking space or driveway or whatever it may be and charge there, or alternatively while you're not using the vehicle. So as we start to see more and more charging access in the places where people leave their cars, in car parks and things like that, the charging time becomes less of a concern if it's in the time when you're not using the vehicle.
And what is the situation with the manufacture of these multiple, many thousands and millions, in fact, batteries that we're going to need, and the metals and the minerals that are required, like cobalt and lithium and so on, and the damage potentially that could do to the environment?
The battery minerals come from mining. If you think about the EV, about 40% of its value is the battery, and about 80% of the value of the battery, or 70 to 80% of the value of the battery, comes from raw materials. That comes from mining. Traditional engine cars, the steel, the aluminium, that comes from mining too. Mining probably has a bad reputation, but if done properly, it shouldn't be harmful at all to the environment. So I think, there's perhaps some misinformation out there about battery minerals being more harmful to the environment than other forms of mining. It's all the same. But the key concern there is
where it comes from, isn't there? There's the whole issue of deep sea mining, but that's a kind of another thing. Is there a point at which we could start recycling the metals used in batteries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, batteries now are highly prized for the minerals that are within them in terms of the recycling market. So there's obviously that's a growing part of the supply chain. There's not too many batteries that are sort of coming back from their original use in the market, whether that's in an EV. There is some coming back from consumer electronics, but people tend to keep hold of those. They don't tend to come back into the system all that efficiently. But certainly the technology to recycle batteries already exists, and it is happening. And actually, the kind of the main feed of recycling or recycled material now is coming from all of those new battery plants. So particularly in the early phases of a new battery plant, when you're kind of fine-tuning your equipment, you end up with what we term battery scrap or off-spec rejects. Those are also getting recycled and going back into the supply chain. So these minerals are endlessly recyclable. You can recycle them as many times as you want. And you can do that to a battery grade. So put that material back into the battery supply chain.
And in the whole EV market, can Europe compete, do you think, with the US and China?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very competitive market. And I think one of the key concerns that the global auto supply chain is managing costs. So as demand for these raw materials, which make up, a big portion of the value of the car, go up, so does their price, because the market's become tighter. So managing costs and obviously being cost competitive, particularly with China, where we typically see a low cost base, can be a challenge. But definitely there's been significant investments made by European automakers, partnerships with cell manufacturers, and also starting to look at investments further up the value chain, which will give them much more control of their costs. So we call that vertical integration, where they're not just buying products from all the different steps in the value chain, they're actually investing in or making partnerships within that value chain to reduce their costs. So that's a key part of the strategy that's going to play out over the next few years.
And finally, Casper, as we go, let's return back to the combustion engine for the last question. There's talk that we could be going to a situation like which you see in Cuba, where lots of old petrol cars are just continually recycled and reused. Is that what's going to happen globally, do you think, as EVs come in and people can't afford them, so you've got to keep running your old car?
I think, what happens there is going to really be defined over what happens over the next decade. If automakers can continue to reduce costs or reduce let's say, the price of the EV, we saw that initiated by Tesla globally a few weeks ago, and a number of automakers have followed suit in terms of reducing the cost of the EV to the consumer, then that becomes less of a question, because if EVs are produced in high numbers and accessible to most people, then that's less of a concern. If that doesn't happen, if costs continue to rise and EVs remain a high ticket item, then the value of second-hand vehicles, petrol or diesel vehicles, could potentially become higher. But as I say, the kind of next 10 years, with what happens with EV strategy, policy from governments, and raw material costs, will really dictate what happens to the legacy kind of aftermarket internal combustion engine supply chain.
Yep, it'll be very interesting to see how it all develops. Casper Rules, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
While fossil fuel cars are being phased down, the airline industry is on the up. Travellers are rushing back to the skies after pandemic restrictions eased. The spike in travel is turning the industry's fortunes around. Carriers suffered more than $200 billion in losses over the past 3 years, but airlines are returning to profitability for the first time since the health crisis started in 2019. The industry is expected to record nearly $5 billion in net profit this year. That compares to almost $26.5 billion 4 years ago. Among them is the International Airlines Group, the owner of British Airways, Spain's Iberia, and other carriers. IAG reported an operating profit of almost $1.5 billion last year. Two of the biggest US airlines recorded better than expected profits on their earnings. Delta Airlines reaped higher revenues last year than it did in 2019, while American Airlines Group said its fourth quarter revenue was the highest in the company's history. And Australia's Qantas raked in a record billion-dollar profit in just 6 months. It had lost $7 billion during 3 years of the pandemic. Qantas is now being accused of ripping off customers with expensive airfares. Meanwhile, Central Asian airlines are benefiting from Russia's closed airspace. Airline traffic into the region surged as European airlines struggled to find new routes into Asia. Flights between many European countries and Uzbekistan, for example, have risen nearly 106% since 2019. The region is expected to continue on an upward trajectory as travel from China resumes. Well, joining us now from London is Rob Morris. He is Global Head of Consultancy at Cirium, which is a global aviation analytics company providing data for travel, airlines, airports and finance. Rob, welcome to the programme. So we have 3 consecutive years of losses, all down to COVID for the airline industry. It's now reversed. How much more ground is there to cover to put the industry on a solid financial footing, do you think?
Okay, hello, Nick. Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of recovery still to come. I mean, after those 3 years, we still see globally demand below 2019 volumes. And whilst, we have seen some airlines recovering their profits, fundamentally this year, globally about a $5 billion net profit across the entire industry is far lower than we saw perhaps in the latter years of the last expansion cycle that ended in 2019. So still some way to go, I think, but better times than it was in 2020 and 2021.
Right, it demonstrates extraordinary resilience, doesn't it? There's quite a recovery given the scale of the financial and economic damage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it actually illustrates the underlying drivers for demand for air travel remain extremely strong. If one thinks about whether we travel for business to generate corporate wealth and trade, or whether we travel for leisure because we've got an increasingly globalized population, the underlying drivers to commercial aviation remain very strong, and that's why airlines have been able to at least come through the pandemic, and that's why, frankly, governments throughout the world have seen it fit to support their airlines because they realise how important they are to economies as they recover from the pandemic.
And the underlying driver is passenger demand, ultimately, right?
Yes, exactly. Passenger demand. So whether it be for, as I say, business or leisure, and interestingly, in this recovery, leisure is leading business. So increasingly, as those of us who've been, suffering from lockdowns through the last couple of years, not been able to travel, as sequentially markets have released, we've seen extremely strong bounce back initially in North America and Europe, and latterly further to come in certainly Asia Pacific and China.
Yeah, I was going to say on Asia, because Asia's lagging behind at the moment, isn't it? It was forecast to post $6.6 billion loss in 2022. So why is that? Take us through that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, the reaction of governments in that region to the pandemic have been somewhat different. So the quarantines and the lockdowns, etc., have gone on further in those regions. The second point is the importance in Asia Pacific of the Chinese market. If one looks at routes from Asia Pacific internationally, a large portion of those touch China. And until China changed its quarantine policy late last year, those markets were not able to act at all. Now, even with the change of quarantine policy, as we look forward to June this year, those markets are still going to be close to 3/4 lower than where they were in 2019. So, China is the key to that, effectively the last brick in the recovery wall. And whilst the quarantine policy change is positive, it's going to take a while for passenger confidence to recover, demand to come back strongly, and Asia Pacific to come back.
What about airfares? They're eye-watering in some cases. Are we going to will that reverse as well?
Potentially. I mean, if one thinks about the way that airlines are pricing right now, it's about the supply and demand dynamic and market economics. As demand has come back strongly, airlines have to some extent had issues with returning capacity quite so quickly. Number of reasons. I mean, they parked aircraft, they furloughed staff. Bringing aircraft out of storage is a costly business, and there's some capacity challenges around that. Bringing staff back is also challenging. And then even when they brought people back, we've seen all of the airport congestion, which has been caused by lack of capacity there. So demand has effectively come back more quickly than supply has. And in any economic system, when demand exceeds supply, then the supplier will naturally leverage price. I think that's why airfares are typically higher than they were. Actually, a personal anecdote: I've got to travel to Japan in a couple of months' time, and I last travelled to Japan in 2019. The airfare I'm paying now is about 50% higher than it were in 2019. Inflation accounts for about 20% of that. Market economics clearly account for the rest.
Yeah, and once market economics levels off, do you think prices will go down then?
Yeah, potentially, but I mean the underlying higher costs we see today are potentially here to stay. Inflation is going to continue to be. We're no longer going to see that low inflationary environment we enjoyed, perhaps over the last 15 years or 20 years or more. So as inflation remains high, as fuel prices remain high, as airlines' cost of debt remains relatively high, interest rates being higher than they were. As maintenance costs have gone up, as the ownership cost of aircraft have gone up, as wages go up with inflation, so costs go up, and consequently airfares need to go up further to maintain margin.
Something at a bit of a tangent, but all related. Net zero emissions by 2050, that's the global goal. Where's the airline industry with that?
So it's an extremely challenging target, I think. I mean, if one thinks about the mechanisms that airlines have potentially to get to net zero, well, the very first thing we need to recognise is that it's very difficult to decarbonise long haul and even short medium haul air travel. So we're going to be burning some form of fuel which emits CO2 for a long time, certainly through 2050. So the challenge then becomes how do we offset or how do we find sustainable fuels, sustainable aviation fuels derived from biomass or other feedstock, which allows us to reduce to net zero. Of course, we do see, and one of the things we've seen through the pandemic, actually interestingly, is that airlines increasingly refleeting, going to more efficient new aircraft, whether they be Airbus A320neos or Boeing 737 Maxes, 787s or A350s, aircraft that typically burn 15% to 20% less fuel than their predecessors and thus emit 15 to 20% less CO2. That helps. That brings us about 10 to 15% of what we need to get to net zero. We can have efficiencies in air traffic control, etc. Whenever one flies into Heathrow in London, you always find yourself holding and therefore burning more fuel than you need to. So efficient air traffic control systems will help. But actually, the largest part is going to have to be offset or sustainable fuels in some way.
Rob, just great to get your expertise. Do appreciate it. Thanks very much. Rob Morris.
Nick, thanks very much.
Now, entire villages were burnt down and families displaced after violence broke out in Sudan's Darfur back in 2003. 20 years after the start of the war, hundreds of thousands of people have no home to return to and remain in camps right across the region. And that's despite a peace deal signed 2 years ago. Many people say the situation is worsening as they go for months without humanitarian aid. The World Food Programme says 65% of the population in West Darfur is food insecure. That is the highest level in Sudan. And experts estimate the conflict has cost nearly $90 billion over 11 years, accounting for damaged infrastructure and homes and lifetime earnings. Aid workers say support to the region is limited and have cut down aid deliveries. Well, joining us from Lecce in Italy is Alessandro De Matteis, a research fellow at the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. Alessandro, welcome to Counting the Cost. First up, what's your assessment of the cost of war to Darfur?
Let's say that the situation in Darfur has been is a complex one. The problem has been going on for ages already. So there is nothing new that we can try to address in an easy way. Localized conflict have been going on and off in various parts of actually not only Darfur but in various parts of the countries for decades. The condition actually has become worse in the entire country since 2001 when there was the coup d'etat. Overall, 370 security incidents have been reported during the last year.
So given that, how much is needed to ease this worsening crisis? What needs to be done?
What is needed, in fact, which means in place we have the peacekeeping operation with the annual budget that can be estimated around $1 billion US. And at the same time, we have the humanitarian response plan, which gets updated every year. And again, we are in the range of, more than $1.5 billion. At the moment, for 2023, the amount is 1.7, sorry, last year was 1.9. So the overall amount in terms of what can be done to recover the situation, so to respond to the damage.
You have the situation where aid workers are complaining about limited support to the region. Why is it happening? Is it because donors are prioritizing other regions in the world?
The problem is slightly different. Every year, the humanitarian response plan gets only partially funded. We are, well, last year, if I'm not wrong, 46% of the overall budget was covered. But even going back in time, let's say the range, the coverage has been always within a range of 40 to 6%, and not much beyond. Now, why this? We can call it donor fatigue. Well, that's a possibility. It's difficult to find a way forward. In other words, it's difficult to think that this year or every year, the question is this year going to be the final one? So it's difficult to think that putting $1 more or adding $1 more to the contribution will make a major change.
It was hoped that the post-Bashir transition would enable relief agencies to move beyond relief work and to look at implementing more durable solutions for Darfur. Why has that not happened? Why is that being hampered?
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem because everything seemed to be set up to move on from relief to development. So from short term to long term. Unfortunately, the situation was not mature enough. It was not conducive for a peaceful long-term solution. And in fact, we have seen what has happened with the coup d'etat. But you see, this needs to be considered within the frame of the political discussion that have been going on. Apparently, the situation is not mature, and very likely this actually can be the reason behind and not had let's say insufficient response from donors. That is probably, they're not satisfied with the approach, with the strategy that has been followed so far.
Alessandro De Mateus, thanks very much indeed.
You're welcome.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything you've seen, you can tweet me at Nick Clark, AlJazz. Please use the hashtag AJCTC, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. So that's it for this edition of Counting the Costs. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.